it's a great pleasure to share this podcast with all of you. I'm with Dr. Helen Hall. She's an associate professor at Nottingham Trent University. And I am Javier Garcia Oliva. I'm a professor of law at the University of Manchester. And this is part of our Balancing Beliefs project that we have shared with you throughout the last few years. We focus on legal issues concerning, not exclusively, but mainly religion and belief. And we bring together, obviously, all disciplines, public and private law matters. And today we're going to talk about a very exciting topic, which is constitutional culture, which is an area that Helen and I have really researched thoroughly in the course of the last few years. But this was prompted because there was a very interesting news that Helen and I were previously discussing, and we just thought we would like to reflect about the whole notion of constitutional culture in light of this interesting piece of news. Then, Helen, what happened exactly?
Well, yes, I mean, as we'll discuss shortly, constitutional culture really concerns the rules and expectations that people have. What do we think is the deal in terms of our collective life? What can we expect from other people, and what can they expect from us in terms of both legal and, to a certain extent as well, social norms? And in all the depressing news at the moment, we were quite struck by a news story, which I'm sure it has a serious side, but we thought was quite funny and quite endearing. There seems to have been a bit of a saga in Warwickshire over a gentleman's topiary. So he's got a bush in his front garden that he's clearly quite attached to and has always spent time trimming or pruning or whatever the proper word is for what you do with bushes. And this guy lives opposite a pub, and there was some conversation and mickey taking over some years over him working in the garden. And in response to all of this, he clipped his bush into the form of a hand showing the middle finger to the people drinking in the pub and making rude comments. And it seems that most people thought that this was good-humoured joshing between neighbours, and it was a community thing which was welcomed. However, somebody at least seems to have taken quite a dim view of this, because he's had a visit from the local police asking whether he would be prepared to do something about the apparently offensive bush, otherwise face somewhat unspecified action. One of the things we haven't seen and aren't clear about is exactly what kind of legal action might be taken here. And he's had letters from the local authority as well. Again, it's not clear from the press reports quite what they've threatened him with. And it's fascinating because on the one hand, this is what seems like quite a local neighbourhood dispute about what is or isn't in good taste to have in your front garden. But it raises all sorts of issues. I mean, one, it raises issues about what we expect from one another as neighbours and community. But it also raises issues about what is it appropriate for the law to interfere with, and where should the law stop and draw the line. And this isn't something which, hard law regulations might be involved with. People might have all kinds of tasteless things in their front garden, but it's their personal property and it's their right. And we thought that this really quite nicely expressed a lot of constitutional culture as we've been thinking about it, isn't it?
Yeah, because, and that's absolutely right, Helen. Because the reality is that we academic lawyers, but lawyers in general anyway, we tend to look at the legal framework sometimes in a very isolated fashion. I think we have all fallen into that trend at times, and probably you and I also in our previous research. I think it's important that law, or to emphasize, I would argue, Helen, that we cannot really understand the legal framework in isolation. Then law doesn't exist in a vacuum. Law is part of a much wider societal project. And that's the fascinating part. Law is a social science, gives response to people's needs, And it's important to understand what is exactly the purpose of this legal instrument, but in a much wider social context. Then people's expectations are really, really important. Therefore, the fact that obviously there are a degree of it's not sufficiently clear exactly what sort of legal action, as you were saying, but the fact that most people have found this attempt on the part of public authorities as rather inappropriate says a lot, I would say, about British constitutional culture. What would you say is the main message that this story conveys about constitutional culture?
I mean, it's interesting because I think it encapsulates quite a lot of things about British culture, and therefore about the way things get translated into law and understood in a legal context. So on the one hand, there is this sense of your home is your private property, it's your space, you should be entitled to be safe, and also a feeling of eccentricity is allowed. If you're not hurting anybody, then you shouldn't be made to conform to other expectations. I think some of the indignation about this, and it also, I think, relates to some quite deep tropes about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. There's no suggestion that this is hate speech. There's no suggestion that he's trying to be aggressive or intimidate people in general or a particular group. And that being the case, there is this discomfort about restraining it. But yet the fact that there is an impulse from at least some people to have tried to intervene, I think also reflects sort of quite British, or perhaps more specifically English, ideas about things being proper and it's not very nice. And there is a thing of, well, we don't want to walk past someone's hedge giving us the finger in the morning.
I think the way we have illustrated it, and I just wanted to share this with our viewers, many of you students of ours, is the idea that constitutional culture is like this lovely egg. What's the name of the
Egbert?
Egbert. And I think it's quite cool because as you can see here, you have the yolk of the egg, and to us in this metaphor that Helen and I are using in our research currently, actually, within the yolk is like the intra-legal stuff, the intra-material, which is obviously the legal framework. And then we're talking about, as we know in the United Kingdom, we're talking about case law, but we are also talking about legislation. And all that is part of the legal part of the egg. But then we have the white, which is clearly all these other aspects which are not legally enforceable. Some of them are part of the wider constitution, which is like constitutional conventions, is a very clear example of that. But certainly there are many other elements in this white part of the egg which are not legal, but which clearly shows that and demonstrate quite clearly that the legal framework contained in the yolk cannot really be understood in isolation without the wider egg and the wider part of the egg. And I suspect we have quite a few examples in our research and in our writing, but I guess sports is a very important example of that.
Yes, and the way things are or aren't treated, because just as in the sort of example with the hedge, if it actually finally comes down to a legal discussion and ultimately even a human rights type discussion, we're concerned with in the yellow part of the egg.
He's still here.
He's still here. Egbert is still here. We're concerned with obviously the Human Rights Act incorporating the European Convention on Human Rights and Article 10 and freedom of expression and all of that. But whether or not it's reasonable to limit expression in certain circumstances depends on the cultural context. And therefore, in order to understand the law, you can only understand the culture in which it sits. And as you were talking about sport, it's quite clear that sport is culturally very important in the UK. There's a wide sort of social obsession with sport. Some of us who aren't very sporty, or at least aren't into watching sport, are bemused by this.
No, it's an important part of the UK culture. Yeah, but understandably people take different views. So.
People take different views, especially when there's some football tournament or other that's coming up and nobody talks about anything else for 6 weeks. Anyway, it was noticeable during COVID, for instance, that some exceptions were made to allow gatherings for sports, different exceptions at different times because obviously the regulations moved, but certainly gatherings were allowed for professional sports, at least to be filmed, at times when there were really quite tight lockdown restrictions. And
I think in that sense the legal framework was pretty lenient towards the practice of sports. And also not only the legal framework, but also the attitude on the part of public authorities in general.
Well, I mean, it was interesting how little criticism there was.
Yeah.
Because there was a real social debate about other things, where the line should or shouldn't be drawn, some really serious things like religious worship, people feeling very strongly both ways about whether it should have been prohibited more or less. There was a lot of debate about whether there was something irrational in the service industry, what was and wasn't allowed to be happening. But nobody really criticised gatherings for the purposes of sport.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, that when you come to make quite serious laws that are having a major impact restricting freedom, the priorities of society dictate the laws that it's going to be acceptable for Parliament to make, and also dictate the way that things are going to be actually interpreted and enforced. Because a lot of the time, of course, it's not just judges and lawyers who are interpreting the law.
Yeah. The law is interpreted by a plethora of factors, and we tend to think exclusively of lawyers and judges, but obviously it's a much wider social endeavor. I think it's a very interesting topic, but we're bound, needless to say, to find it interesting when we share it with our wonderful viewers here. We very much hope you found this discussion about the wider constitutional culture interesting. A lot of work has been done on, we haven't invented the wheel here, we need to be humble about it. Very exciting stuff on and research on constitutional culture has been done mainly in North America, a bit less in Europe, but now there are obviously more and more authors looking into that, including ourselves, and clearly we just thought this would be a very interesting thing to discuss with all of you.
Absolutely, and if you are interested, there are links both to our blog and to some other resources and discussions around constitutional culture in the description box. We hope you've enjoyed the video. Do like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll be back soon with more Balancing Beliefs videos. Thank you very much.
Take care of yourselves. All the best.
Bye.